live yet?
In other words, if
So, we are in luck today again. I'm doubly blessed, I might say. Not only do we have our member Jim Limber webcasting today's program now live, and it will be archived for later pickup if you'd like to view it on the internet. The address is www.ustream. That's U with the letter U, ustream.tv. www.ustream.tv. When you get to that website, there's a search box. Type in UIC-United. Correct, Jim? UIC-United. And that will take you to the archived webcast for today, as well as previous webcasts. Thank you, Jim, again, for doing this for us. Again, the second part of our double blessing today is that we have not one but two individuals from the University of Illinois presenting a program that is of high interest, of course, to all of us, and that is the status of pension legislation in Springfield. Our first on the program will be Avijit Ghosh, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. Or correct me.
My mother claims I don't pronounce my name correctly.
Professor Ghosh is Special Assistant to the President of the University and a Professor of Business Administration at Urbana-Champaign. And his responsibility as Special Assistant is to lead the university's administrative review and organizational effectiveness initiative. He's previously served as Vice President for Technology and Economic Development, responsible for managing the university's intellectual property assets and for leveraging those assets to benefit society and support economic growth and development. He led and managed the university's technology commercialization infrastructure, including the technology transfer offices, early stage investment funds, incubators and research parks that support and nurture the commercialization of university technologies, establish new startup companies, and encourage R&D collaboration between the university and private industry. Quite a portfolio. As Dean of the College of Business, he spearheaded a number of new initiatives, including new academic programs and research centers, and a number of programs at the interface of technology and business. He also fostered significant changes to the undergraduate program, including launching the Business Honors Program and a business minor for non-business students. Before joining the University of Illinois, he served as the Vice Dean and Deputy Dean at NYU's Leonard Stern School of Business. Avijit Ghosh received a Bachelor of Science degree from Calcutta University, a postgraduate diploma in business management from Xavier Institute, and a Master of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Iowa. His research interests are in the areas of marketing strategy, entrepreneurship, retailing, and locational analysis. Professor Ghosh is the author of a number of books on retailing and location analysis, and his research has appeared in leading academic journals in marketing and geography. He's been the editor of the Journal of Retailing and a member of the editorial boards of a number of professional journals. He served on the board of governors of Argonne National Laboratory and Fermi National Laboratory, as well as the board of directors of the Illinois Chamber of Commerce. Before Professor Ghosh begins his presentation, I'll introduce Catherine Cappy Lang, who has 27 years of experience working with legislatures, particularly the Illinois General Assembly. Starting in 1983, working for then Mayor Harold Washington, Ms. Lang has represented the City of Chicago, the Chicago Transit Authority, and the Chicago Public Schools. She also worked for AT&T for 7 years as the Illinois State Government Affairs Director. As Director of Government Affairs for the Chicago Transit Authority, Ms. Lang was responsible for advocacy efforts in Washington, D.C., as well as in the Illinois General Assembly. Cappy began her position as Executive Director for Governmental Relations at the University of Illinois in July 2010. She's a graduate of Northwestern University and IIT Chicago-Kent College of Law. So first on the program will be Professor Ghosh, and then we'll hear from Cappy Lang.
Thank you.
Would you like to start? Oh, okay, please.
Thank you very much. I've been asked to talk about pensions. And as you know, a lot is being said about pensions, but very little is actually being said at all, because there's no clarity in a lot of that, what is being said. I know we've had forums in the past talking about sort of the genesis of the pension issue and things like that. So I'm going to sort of jumpstart a little bit the last 6 months, because in this last 6 months, the whole discussion about pension and pension reform has really gotten accelerated. And there's a lot of reasons why it's gotten accelerated, but the most important, of course, is the sort of the state's overall financial distress and overall financial situation, and which pension payments representing a very, very significant part of the state's obligation, that has affected the ability to really create a budget which the state can live with and pass, as well as a lot of pressures from the state bond rating agencies about the sort of past overdues that the state has to pay to people. As you know, there's about, states sort of now owes about $6 billion to people, including this university, for payments that have not been made. So that overhang has created a tremendous amount of pressure for some kind of a resolution. And the governor put together this working group which has representatives of legislative leaders as well as the governor's staff to try to come up with some proposals. And this working group has been meeting for the past 6 months. It has met with a number of different stakeholders, including the public university presidents and chancellors, the community colleges, school district, labor groups, labor leaders. They have had a number of meetings, and I have attended some of those meetings. I was asked by all the public university presidents and chancellors to represent them in some of these discussions, along with a couple of other colleagues, which we have been doing. So that working group was supposed to give its recommendation on April 17th. But on April 17th, they announced that they really didn't seem to have a consensus yet, so they're going to take a little bit more time. And at that point, the governor said that he is going to put forward a proposal or ideas or suggestions that should guide the rest of this discussion on pensions going forward. As you probably know, a couple of days prior to that, he had done the same thing of putting forward a suggestions for Medicaid reform. So in the same spirit, he wanted to put forward these proposals. And so let's talk about that for a little bit, but then we can broaden that discussion to sort of what it means. One of the problems of any pension reform, or if you look at pensions, the pension represents a number of different things. One cannot look at pensions in isolation of everything else, because a pension is a package of things that are offered to employees. It's a package that includes compensation, it includes other kinds of benefits. It should be looked in the context of that entire package. So there's a sort of a human resource, a human talent management, workforce management kind of issue that comes in. There's obviously financial issues that come in. But what is obviously also seems to be having a tremendous effect is the political issues that come in. So one has to find a solution that sort of somehow captures all of those three aspects. So the public universities have been trying to argue for that viewpoint, as well as the viewpoint that promises that have been made to employees, including a constitutional guarantee, must be honored, and benefits that employees have earned must be honored, they cannot be changed. And that the state has an obligation to fulfill its unfunded part of the pension, which is one of the big overhangs here that hangs over it. So the government's response to all of this is to give people a choice between a bad apple and a bad orange. Frankly. But it's a choice that's been given, so I think one can say that nobody is technically being pushed into the new system. So he has proposed some changes to the current system, and he has proposed a new system, and he's saying nobody is being forced into the new system, but the changes being proposed for the current system are pretty significant. But the proposal lacks a lot of detail right now, so it's very difficult to really sort of analyze it because it lacks a lot of detail. But first of all, it gives us choices. So what's the choice if one stays within the program, with the current program? In the current program, the benefits will all remain, everything will remain, except there's going to be a change in other kinds of benefits. People will lose, they're saying that there might be changes in the medical premiums that people will have to pay, or right now some people don't pay if you've worked for 20 years. There'll be a change in that medical premium that retirees pay when they retire. So it's not decreasing the pension benefits, but it's decreasing a benefit. So, and then the other confusing part is it talks about pensions being calculated on a frozen pay. The future pays increases would not be included in the calculation of pension, which frankly, if you think of it from a purely pension perspective, it's very hard to explain what is actually being proposed there. If somebody is 30 years old now and is going to retire 30 years from now, you can't calculate pension based on what they're earning today. That's not how pension systems work. So it's very difficult to sort of decipher really what that part of the proposal is. Now what about, excuse me, what about the revised program? In the revised program, there are a number of things that are happening. One is the proposal is to increase the age of retirement, which, as you know now, the normal age is 60. It's proposed that the normal age will go up to 67, but it don't go up overnight. It will go up in a graduated kind of manner. So it might go up to 62 first, then a few years later go up to 65. Again, the details are not there, but it will, over time, it will go up to 67. That's one change. The second change is really the change of cost of living adjustment. Right now, one has a cost of living where it's either half the rate of inflation or 3%, whichever is higher, and it's a compounded every year that increases, compounded every year. What is proposed in this is it's half of inflation or 3%, whichever is lower, and it's not compounded. Okay. Now, this, just to give you a background, this COLA, the age increase, and let me speak a little bit on purely from a sort of a pension policy issue. If you look at it as a pension policy, most people will argue that 60 is a low age. That given the longevity, lifespans of people, most pension systems have moved away from 60. So I think a lot of pension experts would agree that moving the age slowly up is a reasonable kind of proposal. But on the other hand, this COLA, the cost of living adjustment, has attracted a lot of attention lately. But everybody has been talking about this is that people are getting a lot of increases, which is true because the inflation has been very low and it's a guaranteed 3% in correction. But you also have to remember inflation in the future could be 7%, could be 8%, could be 10%. So one has to keep that in mind, that when you're creating pension policy, you're creating for not just for today's condition, it's the conditions that might be in the future. And secondly, the idea of not compounding pension, just taking a simple increase in pension, really can take away the sort of purchasing power of pension, and one has to be very, very careful of how one structures that. Okay. So from my purely pension policy perspective, I would say that COLA reduction is a real impairment here because it can affect future retirees in a very significant kind of way. Then it has a number of other proposals, which has mostly to do with funding. Okay. It proposes that over time, employees start paying more than what they're paying today. Right now, they're paying 8% of pension, mostly for retirement benefits. Some, a little bit of that goes to disability insurance and things like that, but let's say 8%. And it proposes that over time, that increases by 3%. Again, over how long, what period is not clear. Then there's another big issue, which has been a big part of the pension discussion in Springfield for the last few months, which is this so-called normal cost and who pays the normal cost. What is normal cost? Normal cost essentially is what is the true annual cost of the benefits that have been given. Now, in state of Illinois, you have another cost, which is the unfunded liability. The cost of making up for payments that should have been made that have not been made. And that's the unfunded liability. That's not the normal cost. So you might say if there was no unfunded liability, if everything had been paid, what would be the annual cost? That's the normal cost. Okay? And the normal cost is about 20% of pay. Employees pay 8%, and right now the state pays 12%. That's the normal cost. Okay? It fluctuates a little bit, but on an average it's been about 20% for the last decade or so. Okay? Now, there's been a lot of debate about who is responsible for that 12%. Sometime about 4 or 5 months ago, we first started hearing the state leaders talking about, well, school teachers are not, they're employees of the school districts. They're not really employees of the state directly. So the normal cost should be the responsibility of the school districts, not the state. Now you can very quickly take that argument to community colleges the same way, public universities the same way. Okay? And so we have seen that argument now grow to the sense that some people have argued that all the normal costs should get transferred to school districts, community colleges, public universities. Then the state is left with the pure state employees, which is about 22% of the entire system. And if you read the governor's statement, you saw there was a reference to that the state really has only 22% of the pension problem is the states. Okay. So part of the governor's proposal now is that these normal costs be transferred to school districts and community colleges and universities. Again, it says over time, transition. There's no detail on how much will be transitioned, over what time period will be transitioned. We know that from other discussions that have gone on, we've been a part of, that there's some group which would like to see the entire 12% transition, sent over. Some groups which feel that there should be some middle ground here, which feel over. but the message of some amount of normal cost transfer has been pretty clear and is reiterated in this governance proposal. So, what's the implication of all this? First of all, and I'm sure Cap, you might address this later on, it's not clear where this goes from here. This is not a legislation, this is not a bill, this is not a proposal. Nobody has seen any legislative language that goes with it. So where it's going to go from here is not clear. On the other hand, one has to see that from just looking at statements that other people have made, there seems to be some level of support for this idea. Some people feel that this choice that this governor has given is a way to address the constitutional issue. Frankly, it's not clear that it really addresses the constitutional issue at all. So one could expect that even if a bill is passed, there might be a constitutional test of it. But, you know, I think there's a lot of adaptations that are going to happen, but some framework like this is going to probably be put into place where you can either stay in the system or go into move into a revised system. If you stay in the system, there are certain other kinds of impact it will have, or you can go into the new system. It seems like at least this has set that kind of a structural thinking as to how the state is going to deal with the pension issue. But I think there'll be a lot of adaptations to what this transition period of age and what the transition period of payments or COLA even, there could be adaptation. Yesterday, I heard that some people are trying to propose a third option, which will be you can choose between 3 options, not just 2, which might have a better COLA in it as a reward for additional employee contributions. So there might be other kinds of things like that might get floated along the way. So the process is still, the outcome is still quite uncertain. But to me, one of the biggest problems is this uncertainty. For our faculty and staff, this uncertainty is what is creating the biggest difficulty in dealing with. Because people can't deal with this kind of uncertainty on such an important kind of issue. Whether it be new employees or existing employees, you have to give certain level of certainty. And so in some sense, you know, it'll be good for us to get some solution here and try to get the best solution possible, but this dragging along and this uncertainty is obviously causing a lot of people to decide to retire, and there's a very accelerated rate of retirements people are looking at. It has also made what the governor's proposal does not address at all is the whole sort of tier 2 issue. People who have joined after January 1, 2011, we know that tier 2 really created a very inferior pension system. And if some of you, as you know, if you have seen the proposal put by IGPA, the Institute of Government and Public Affairs, one of the big focus of that was to change or modify the program, pension program that was put in for people who have just recently joined, to bring that into and create a hybrid kind of system for them. And that's something the universities have been pushing a lot with legislators, but the governor's proposal does not address that issue at all. And that's something we plan to keep pushing for some changes in the tier 2 system, because that does not address it all. But as I was saying, this uncertainty is what is causing great harm to universities right now, and our ability to retain and attract the best faculty and best staff. That's what universities have to be focused on. That's what we need to try to do. And this pension uncertainty is really putting a constraint on that, reaching that goal. I will stop right now, but I will be welcome to take more questions.
I think it's best if we have both presentations and then we'll open it.
Okay, so we'll let
Thanks, Avijit, and thanks, Farrell. My name is Kathy Lang, and I am the Executive Director of the University Office of Governmental Relations. And as you can tell from Avijit's presentation, we've got our hands full in Springfield this year. I just wanted to frame this a little bit by saying that in addition to proposed legislation, we're also looking at pension changes that are being driven by the laws on the books, and specifically the election that some people will be wanting to make in late June concerning their money purchase option. So that's not part of the pension conversation that is going on in Springfield right now, but it's influencing a lot of people's behavior as they look at their future. And one of the side effects of that is there's been legislative interest in regulating the practice of university rehiring its retirees. So a bill that we actually do have, we've seen it, we've analyzed it, we've testified on it, we're working on amendments to it, is the bill that's offered by Daniel Biss, who's a math professor from the University of Chicago and a pretty smart guy, who would like to reduce the number of faculty members who leave the payroll and then rejoin the payroll as instructors, maybe teaching a single course or maybe operating in the labs. We're real concerned about this bill because obviously we teach a lot of classes, maybe using a professor who teaches a single class, or lab personnel who are working on a grant. They retired, but they're still continuing their research. So I wanted, you may have questions about this, but I just wanted to mention it in connection with everything else that Avijit said. I think he did a real good job of covering the complex topic of the governor's pension proposal. I'll just, in closing, I know you guys have a million questions, so I'm going to wrap it up, but I just wanted to opine about what I think will happen in the remaining 5 weeks of the spring session. As you probably know, our scheduled adjournment date is May 31st, and that's only 5 weeks away. We've not seen a single printed word yet that expresses this very complex proposal that the governor is making. In working with Avijit on trying to get our Tier 2 proposal drafted up, we've encountered first-person singular the difficulties of presenting a complex idea in a legal format. So, and if you get it wrong, the consequences are long-lasting and could be severe. So it's important for them to take the time to put this proposal in its best possible light. So many people who hang around the rotunda of Springfield think that the clock will simply run out on spring session on getting these proposals ready. Another factor that may influence the timing of this is the fact that after May 31st, the rules of the game change. So when we enter the second half of the year, in order to pass legislation that's immediately effective, the bills would require a 3/5 vote. That probably isn't extremely important in connection with this pension proposal, because we think it'll have a lagged effective date of at least 1 year and maybe 18 months. But it's another factor in the calculations of the political leaders. So maybe they'll push this bill off until the veto session after the general election. There will be a record number of lame ducks this year in November. So maybe the legislative leaders are thinking, we'll push this decision into the fall. There'll be a number of people who can safely vote for it because they're not coming back. Again, we think that bill would have a lagged or delayed effective date of about a year. Or a third scenario, which is what they chose when they were passing the income tax increase 2 years ago, was to put the vote off into January, when again you only need a simple majority. You're still dealing with lame ducks because the new General Assembly hasn't been sworn in. So we're looking at these 3 time frames as being possible time frames for the big picture, change the 5 system pension reform that Avijit described. I think that this other bill, the bill that regulates the rehiring of retirees, is going to pass in the next couple of weeks. It's going to become the law of the land. We're working to get its effective date pushed off by at least a year, and hopefully we can get it extended a little bit further than that. We're also working on some technical fixes to make it easier for our HR people who are here today. Thank you very much for joining us to implement. So that's kind of the current report from Springfield. Again, I know that you guys have lots and lots of questions, so I'll turn it back over to Meryl and we can try to see if we have answers for you. Thanks very much for having us today.
Thank you both. Thank you for coming and for presenting things in such a clear and lucid way. Are there questions? I would be surprised if there weren't. Irv, you want to come to the microphone, please?
The governor's proposal includes a provision which says he will guarantee that the legislature will fund pensions as stipulated. Why should we believe him?
That's it. Every time I talk about every time we have had discussions about pension, we have had that question. You're right. There's no way I can tell you that whatever guarantee is going to be honored. But the governor has done something. There's some of that discussion actually going on, and I know they've been looking at language independent of the governor's proposal. People, some of the legislators have been looking at language which at least forces the state to do certain things, and there are certain kinds of languages you can put in where, and the effect, in effect, what it does is as soon as state receipts come in, this is the first thing that gets paid. So, you know, that's the kind of language that is, and we've seen examples of some of those languages being very seriously discussed. So that might be one way you try to do it. I should also note that in the governor's proposal, there is a very specific plan for paying off the unfunded liabilities. So that's what he is claiming people get in exchange, is the very, and this plan is more aggressive than the current plan. In the current plan, things get paid over the next 40 years. 80% of the unfunded liability gets paid over in the next 40 years. In the governor's plan, 100% of the unfunded liability gets paid over the next 30 years. So that's the governor's idea, that people are getting something in return because this is getting a guarantee on that unfunded liability.
I just wanted to add, this is the biggest problem that the General Assembly faces in trying to pass this legislation, is how to build an ironclad guarantee into the law. Another way, a different approach than the one that Avijit described, would be to give individual employees a right to action, a right to sue their employer for non-payment of the pension contribution. And as we're looking at stepping into the shoes of the employer, that's a very frightening notion, that our employees would be suing us in court for payments maybe that the state didn't make, if the state retains a portion of the normal cost. So there's, as is the case with so many things concerning pensions, it's always a little bit more complex beneath the surface than it would appear as first presented.
Other questions? David Bardak, please.
Two questions. What was it, 1984, when the state stopped paying its mandatory payment? And whatever the date was, how much would have come in had they consistently paid, and what would be the effect on the $80 billion shortfall? That's the first question. The second one, that's just a statistical issue. The second one is, for any of the pension groups, there's a need to get the public aware of what the realities are. The Tribune is doing a great job of what the realities aren't, and the misconstrued knowledge of what people are getting and so forth. What kind of plans are being hatched to bring the public up to date as to how pensions actually are paid for by the individuals as well, and the misunderstandings of what the realities are.
Let me try to address your second one, because I agree with you. I think one of the biggest problems here is that the facts are not very well known. Okay, and you can't solve problems without the facts being known. Okay, and the state, nobody has done a good job of it. You know, the IGPA probably comes closest to putting some of the facts out, but there is no website, for example, where you can go and look at all the 5 pension systems and know the facts and what payments came in, what didn't come in. You have to dig very, very hard to try to come out. You know, the pension issues are being debated in a number of different states. Public pension issues are being debated in a number of states are trying to find some new solution or revision. You know, probably the only state I know where the pension reform has been generally embraced by all the stakeholders is a reform they did in Rhode Island. It's a smaller state, smaller problem, but one of the things they did was they put out this website where they put all the facts out, and people could look at the facts both retroactively what has happened and prospectively if nothing changes what might happen, so you have a common basis. Unfortunately, there hasn't been that here. As I said, there are a few groups which have tried, but that's not there. With regard to your first question, you know, yes, it's been about 20 years since the state has not paid its full payments. One way to think about it is if the state made this entire payment, there wouldn't be an $80 billion unfunded liability. So the cost of the unfunded is $80 billion. Now, it's not all $80 billion, because what you're counting also is if they had made those payments, then there would have been market returns on those payments, those money would have been invested. So if you take the payment plus the loss of investment, that's $80 billion. I don't know exactly how those two break out.
Yes.
Many years ago, the retirement system was an asset conceptually in the state of Illinois. And if you were coming into the system in the 60s, if you were fortunate, you had several opportunities to be in the academy or in my profession, the profession itself, and somewhere in between. Is anyone, well, I'm sure anyone is doing this, but for Illinois to keep its competitive situation, in my case, Rice and Washington, Seattle, and UIC, in order to keep the net up for generations to come, is somebody advising Governor Quinn, for example, we need to do this to compete with Northwestern and Penn and Washington and Seattle?
Sure, that has been a very consistent message from the University presidents and chancellors, that the pension is a very important part of our competitiveness amongst other universities and our peers, and that some of these changes which are being proposed has a tremendous impact of reducing our competitiveness, and that message has been consistently kind of delivered and done like that. So yes, that message is good.
Dick?
I think we're focusing now on something very important, that is communication. And having been concerned about this issue for a number of years with a number of administrations, they seem to be coming along fairly frequently in recent years. But anyway, the university showed no evidence of being concerned about the problem. And I think there's been a change now that there is concern, but I think we're still lacking in communication to the folks in the trenches. I gave a report to this group earlier today about a couple of meetings SUAA have held where we have heard President Peters, for example, of Northern Illinois, report to their faculty about where things stood, even though it's very confusing. But at least there's some evidence of a flow of communication. And he has been consistent. He's been really the only, at least in my experience, the only leader of a university who has constantly bringing the faculty and staff, retirees, and active employees up to date. So I've learned a lot today about what's happening within the university, but I really think that there has to be a show of this interest and concern on the part of the president and the chancellors.
I think your advice is well taken, and definitely will communicate that advice. I just want to point out one thing, the seminar and the forums that President Peters did. What has happened here is that the IGPA, the Institute of Government and Public Affairs, have really been the focal point for putting out some of the information on pensions and what's going on. As you know, they did 2 or 3 forums, one here a few months ago and then one previously. And that forum that was held here 2 months ago is exactly the same content that other universities have then adopted and used that at NYU and SIU. Everybody has worked out some of those forums. So we've been using IGPA, but your message is well taken and really conveyed.
If I could just follow up on what Dick mentioned, President Peters sent out an email to all of his staff, faculty, and annuitants, and it appeared on the NIU website, and we have it now on the UIC United new blog, and I strongly encourage everyone to read it. There is an item in it that I wanted to bring up and mention to you at this point, and that is President Peters mentioned that since the state of Illinois doesn't allow its, or has gotten out of the requirement to have its employees be part of Social Security, and since Social Security requires an employer to contribute a minimum of 6.5%, then the governor's proposal to transfer essentially 100% of the employer's contribution away from the state would seem to be at odds with the Social Security requirement.
Sure.
Would you like to comment on that?
Oh, I absolutely agree. And that statement, if you see our that IGPA proposal that we have been pushing, that it starts off with that notion that there has to be, the state has to be, you're right, that most people outside of the university systems don't understand that we don't have Social Security. So what this is, our pension system is both a Social Security system as well as a pension system. And as a Social Security payments of 6.2% is what we have proposed and still propose to the state as the minimum payment that the state should be making. And that actually drove our thinking about what the new Tier 2 program should be, because that has to include both the Social Security aspect as well as the pension aspect.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is a really interesting example of how, again, all of the shoals are beneath the surface of the water. the word, the term in dispute here is employer. Who is the employer? The governor and the Speaker of the House this year have taken the stance that we're not actually employees of the state at all. We're employees of some other entity. It's easiest to see when you're talking about K through 12 school districts outside of the city of Chicago. Those teachers are employed by a school district that's incorporated under the laws of the state of Illinois, and yet the state of Illinois pays for their pension contributions, and it's been that way historically forever. We, however, are subject to regulate. We're created by the state, we're subject to regulation by the state, and until we switch the idea of who's the employer, the state of Illinois makes the pension contributions, makes the health care contributions. So there's a lot of consequence in this discussion of who is the employer, who should pay the Social Security equivalent. As Avijit said earlier, we don't know how this dispute's going to work out, but there's a lot of impact in this term employer. It's meaningful as we work our way through the discussion of how to restructure the pensions.
Betty?
Okay, that's part of my question.
Betty, you want to come up here so the people out in the hinterlands can...
Okay, this is the first I've come upon this idea of normal pension amount. And to what you just said, who is the employer? Now, if they decide that UIC is the employer, where does UIC get its 12%?
I agree, and that's one of the reasons of that you have to cut, that the state really should not consider shifting all the pension costs to the universities, because where is the universities going to get that from? Now, if you think about school districts and community colleges, as Kathy mentioned, they're not state. They have separate bodies and they have separate tax-raising authorities. Universities do not have tax-raising authorities. Now, whether they can raise taxes in this environment is a very different issue, but theoretically they have taxing authority. Universities do not have taxing authority. One of the points we have been very strongly making, not just we, all the universities have been very strongly making, that what the state is going to force universities to do is to rely more and more on tuition. And as it is, the tuition rates at universities are getting to a point that is denying access to a lot of people. It's becoming very difficult. If we start increasing the tuitions even more as a result of this, then frankly, a lot of universities are going to have a very hard time attracting the right type of students that we want to attract here. So that's absolutely a very important consequence of this whole normal cost shift and who's the employer kind of debate that's going on.
And just as an addendum to that, you recall Professor Ghosh mentioning that the normal cost to the employer this year is about 20%.
No, to the employer about 12%.
12%.
Total.
Okay, to the total contribution would be 20%. So, is that correct? This year, 12% for the employer and 8% for the employee. Okay, so even if the university, even if the state picked up 6.5% of that 12%, it's still just a little more than half. There's still about half of the normal cost. And I think I recall you said during your panel presentations that for the University of Illinois, if it picked up 100%, it would be $165 million a year.
For us, for the University of Illinois,
if it
picking up the 12% would actually mean about $175 million a year. Okay, the university has no ability to absorb that kind of a cost without absolutely having. So I personally, I don't think that can happen. Okay, and there are other public universities for whom this will be absolutely disastrous.
Okay. Yes.
You mentioned the rehiring of retirees bill that's about ready to be passed. Where is that at, and where do you see that?
The bill is up in Senate Pension Committee this afternoon at 2 o'clock.
And the question is, what do you think is going to...
It's hard to know. The sponsor, both the Senate sponsor and the House sponsor have been more than open to talking to us about making the bill work. They've been open to many of our arguments about exempting, say, federal research from the reach of the bill. We had a productive meeting earlier this week with the State University Retirement System CERS, who will administer this. We have a common concern that if it becomes law, it actually works. We've jointly written a letter that recommends additional amendments to the bill. We haven't presented that yet to the sponsor because we just finished it up literally yesterday, but I'm going with Maureen Parks, who's the HR director of Springfield, next week to continue to work on it. We'll get it to be as good as it can be. The sponsors have strong opinions about what they perceive to be a big loophole that they want to try to close, so they want to restrict our ability to just hire anybody at any level and keep them on forever. But we're hoping that we can protect a lot of what we're doing today, both in research and in teaching. I do tell you, though, I think that this bill, which passed the House unanimously, is going to pass the Senate with probably a similar roll call in a couple of days or weeks. And you have to predict, with that momentum, the governor would sign it.
One more question on my part. There's another...
Which is your prerogative.
My prerogative. There's another bill coming before the Executive Committee this afternoon that we're all very interested in. The constitutional amendment. You want to say something?
I've been waiting for that question.
Yes. I sent out a note yesterday to everyone.
So I think that I'm going to be a little bit cynical, if I may be given leave to do that. Last week, the Speaker of the House, I think it was 2 weeks ago, the Speaker of the House proposed a constitutional amendment that would require the General Assembly to enact by a 3/5 majority at any time of the year legislation that would improve pension benefits for state employees. We think that this is just pure showbiz, because the truth is that most pension legislation that increases benefits are passed unanimously. However, because the bill is the product of the Speaker's thought, and because the bill is the product of the President of the Senate's thought, we've tried to stay out of the range of fire on it, because it did pass the House unanimously last week, and it is going to pass the Senate unanimously in a couple of weeks. And then procedurally, constitutional amendments are submitted to the electorate. So if they can be first in line to get on the ballot, there's a cutoff point, so you need to be hurried to get it in line for it. Then the voters in November would have the choice to approve it by a 3/5 majority of those voting on the question or not. Given the way that public pensions have been demagogued recently, I can't imagine that the electorate would turn this measure down. So, it is consequential, there's no question about that, but the politics of it are such that the bill, the proposal is seemingly unstoppable.
And doesn't it open the door for future anti-pension legislation or constitutional?
I tell you what our concern is, frankly, is that we are putting a ton of effort into making Tier 2 work and having it be something that people will not turn down our offers of employment when they find out what the pension package looks like. So that might be deemed an improvement, would be an improvement, under this joint constitutional amendment resolution. That's really what is most concerning about it, is that if we can't get our fixes done before the November general election, then and it were to be approved, then we would have our hands tied. Unless we could convince, the 4 caucuses that this is something that is meritorious and should surpass the 3/5 vote. So it just changes our strategy a little bit.
Thank you. Next question. Rose, Dr. Rose.
Is the SUAA been working with the teachers?
Step up to the microphone. Microphone.
Has the SUAA been working with the teachers union at the university, which is now one majority
The SUAA convenes a weekly roundtable in Springfield, and the universities and the unions participate in it. So at that level, I would say the answer to your question is yes. At a different level, I would say the answer is no, in that the governor's office chose to meet separately with the various stakeholder groups. So we were called in one panel. Avijit was one of the spokespersons, and the labor unions were called before the governor in separate sessions. I don't know if the annuitants were consulted at all, to be honest, but we try informally to be sure that we all know that what each other is advocating, and to the greatest extent possible, we try to harmonize it.
Thank you. Yes, in the back, please. Come to the microphone.
I attended the March Forum, Kathy, when you were there, and the IGPA plan was presented. And I just wanted to confirm that the legislators actually have a copy of that plan, because I went right home and called my senator's office and said, I support this plan, I think it's good. And they said, what? We don't know what your will talk to, and nobody ever called me back. So what do I call it when I call them back so that they know they actually have it?
Thank you for that vote of support. The process that the governor chose to follow this year really disadvantaged us in a certain sense, because there were only really 4 legislators who were closely informed of what was going on, and the others had to sort of volunteer for it and keep up with it through their own information channels and through their own levels of interest, and because it's pensions and it's hard work. Many legislators did not choose to bone up on the IGPA plan, and to your point, Dick, I think we can improve our communications a lot. So I hope that you could send your legislator a link to the plan. As we were preparing, as Avijit and I were trying to plan what we would say to you today, we had intended to come and talk to you about the IGPA proposal and hope that you would advocate for it, but really the governor's announcement on Friday of his own plan has kind of taken center stage, and we think that that will be the focal point now of discussions going forward. It's been our strategy to try to keep breathing life and hope into the Tier 2 aspect of the IGPA plan, because we're the only people talking about it. And for the university's future competitiveness, it's really important that we fix that up and make it work right, because we've seen cases already of us being turned down by prospective hires because they went back home and showed what we've got to their financial advisor, who said, you must be crazy to think about going to this place. We have to fix this.
Marcia?
We have 5...
Come to the...
just in line with what you said, we have 5 pension systems, obviously, that the state's responsible for, and it's difficult to know which one of these fixes they're talking about. Is it the teachers? Is it the universities? Everybody has such different...
Good point. The 5 funds are very different. If you were to sit down, if you were silly enough to sit down and study them, you'd find that their architecture is different, their features are different, the benefits that are offered are different. Within the SURS article, there are inconsistencies of the meaning of the word dependent. It's a mess. So this is a reason why, again, I say that we can be doubtful that maybe the governor's bill drafters will be ready to work five things all at once. Our IGPA proposal concentrated on SURS for the simple reason that it was something we thought, we immediately from the business school perspective, that we could get our arms around and understand. We did not attempt to make any recommendations concerning the state's largest system, which is the teacher's retirement system, or the General Assembly Fund, or the Judges Fund, or the State Employees Fund. It's just, the task was just too difficult.
One was, if the state seems to want to get out of the business of being an employer or whatever, why is it then that they continue to want to keep nooses around the neck of the university so that they can't, I mean, they can't work autonomously. And also, why don't they just give the land to the university so they can make some money in a sense that's, you know, privatize the whole thing then? I mean, why isn't there some movement?
This is a policy question, not a political question. I'm handing this hot potato off to you.
I mean,
Well, I can only echo what you're saying, because that would be the rational question to ask. There's a bigger, even if you forget all the other things and just focus on pension, there is a huge bigger issue where if the state transfers all the normal costs, let's say the university or school district, but by state statute, the state legislators are still going to make the rules. So they're no longer, this is what economists call the agency problem, right? That the people who are going to make the rules are not going to be the ones who are going to bear the cost of it. So first of all, if that normal cost transfer happens, I still believe that's not going to happen. But if it happens, then we have to sort of completely rethink how we administer pensions. Then let the universities administer them. Okay? Why keep all the power with people who are not going to, don't want to call us state employees anymore?
We have time maybe for two more questions. Ms. Lang has to leave very shortly. Brenda.
As someone who retired last year, I watched this last year with the conversations and have continued to do so. I live in Daniel Biss's district and I know him, and I have discussed some of this with him. And actuarially and also emotionally, I think he's in the right place. And he does listen, he is easy to talk to. Seems to me where it's gone off the rails is lumping the teachers with the universities, both from the ability for the school districts to tax and from the numbers, and perhaps, and I don't know this, with the retire reemployment, that maybe there is a loophole that is being, I was on the school board once, so I don't know quite how to say this, advantageously interpreted. And some of this has to do with the health plan from the 55 to 65. And so it's deferring costs and moving costs from one pocket to another pocket. This is a very complicated situation. Now I've retired, so the one I'm watching really closely is the reemployment, because I'm reemployed, partly on grant funds that'll be exempt, partly on state funds because I'm teaching, which won't be, and yet this is going to come in midstream of many of us who are in the same position. I hope that you can write in and get some of these situations clarified. In some senses, though, change must come, and the plan is too generous and has been. And then it goes in the wrong direction and makes it ridiculously uncompetitive. That's not the solution. Somewhere in between. And I wish we would hear more about those medical expenses, because I think trying to offload them back to the schools and those other kinds of reasoning may be what's behind this. It may be rational and coming through to me in a very dangerous way right now. That wasn't really a question, but health plans, and thank you, and watch it.
Thank you, Brenda.
One more question, and then we have to adjourn. George?
Something that I have heard about here and there, but don't have anything in paper, have seen nothing in paper, is that something that may be on the table is, well, two things. One is eliminating health benefits for those who are already retired, and taxing benefits as well, if they don't eliminate.
Right. So those were the 2011 ideas. There was legislation introduced last year in the Senate that would have eliminated health benefits for retirees, And the President of the Senate did float a trial balloon on the taxation of retirement benefits. Illinois is one of the few, maybe only, Avijit, states in the country that does not tax retirement income at all.
Seven? Thank you.
Certain states do not.
So I think that what they've done this year is to recycle the health benefit proposal into this swap idea, where you'd be thrilled to keep your health benefits but leap into the slimmer retirement program, or not, depending on your life circumstances. But the Senate in particular has adopted a constitutional theory that benefits can be changed as long as there's a choice involved. So the person voluntarily chooses to forego something in exchange for something else of value. So that's what they've been trying to create a structure that would satisfy the constitutional protection of benefits, the impairment clause, by saying that we're really not changing your benefits, we're just offering you a different choice set. And they are convinced that this is a way to achieve a good result in the Illinois Supreme Court. So it's kind of a refashioning of last year's idea into a new package. The President of the Senate, while not outright giving an endorsement to the governor's proposal, has said that he felt that its elements would indeed satisfy constitutional scrutiny. So I think that what we're seeing is a kind of recycling of that last year idea.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. There were still people. Great. Concern.